Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grimflayer, and I hope you're all doing very well today. It is the eve of February, it is the eve of a new month, and therefore we are updating our deck tech. We are updating our Golgari Midrange build because even though we've been doing very, very well with it, you can always improve it, right? You can always improve it. So that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to talk about what changes we made and why. But first, we need to give a shout out to our newest patron, Jack Thompson. Jack Thompson is our newest patron, and he is a confidant. So welcome to the fold, Jack. Thank you so much for your support, and thank you to all of my patrons, as always, for supporting this channel. Speaking of which, to all of my patrons, our February scouting report, the subject of which is Grixis Shadow, is just about done. You know, by the time people are realistically watching this, it will be done. Let's say that. So, unless you're the first viewer and unless you pause the video right now to go look at it, yeah, maybe I'm still working on it, but I'm pretty close to having that published. So, keep an eye out for that. Let me know what you think about that. I hope that helps all of you with the Shadow matchup. For those of you who don't know, the scouting reports are a Patreon exclusive offering that I produce one per month. Patrons at certain tiers get to vote and decide what it is I'm writing about. As always, I'm kind of at the whim of my supporters, and this month it was Grixis Shadow, so we get really involved in not only, you know, we'll talk about sideboarding, of course, but we talk about mindset, we talk about play patterns against specific cards, we do a little bit of statistical analysis on recent decks. So if you want to get down on anything like that, you know what to do. Grimflayer MTG is on Patreon, link below. You can support the content you love, and you can get access to some cool stuff like that scouting report. So go ahead, patrons, and check that out if you're so inclined. But without further ado, let's talk about what changes we made for the month of February, what changes we're going to make for the next month of gameplay. So one or two commenters have said, you know, hey, can you show us the changes you make first? Whether that be because people don't have time to watch the full video, or maybe so they can see all the changes and then continue listening and focus on, you know, focus on my explanations of why without being kind of distracted by what the other changes are going to be. So I like that idea. Let's do that right away. So as you can see, we've got 62 cards in the main deck right now. That is because we've added a Marsh Flats. So we're going to add a Marsh Flats, and we're not going up to 25 land. We're actually going to cut the Twilight Mire for now. So that's change number one. Marsh Flats in, Twilight Mire out. The second change, as you may have noticed, we have back up to the full 4 copies of Liliana of the Veil. Something's got to make way for her. It's very hard to make this cut, but I'm going to cut away a Liliana the Last Hope, but she's not leaving the 75 entirely. We're going to move her off to the side, and then we need to make room for her in the sideboard. This one was another very tough one, but we're going to lose our Choke. So those are the 3 changes. Marsh Flats replaces Twilight Mire. Liliana of the Veil replaces Liliana the Last Hope, but Last Hope still in the 75, moves to the side, replacing Choke. That's the short list of changes. That's what we're doing for this month, so let's talk about why. If you haven't seen my recent videos, we've played 2 competitive leagues with our live recorded on the channel with our January list. We went 5-0 with the first one and 4-1 with the second one. So you might be wondering why make any changes at all. Clearly the list is capable of putting up big results. Well, that is true, but we don't want to fall prey to results-oriented thinking. If we had gone 0-5 and 1-4, that wouldn't mean that my list had no merit whatsoever and we have to scrap it. We have to start from square one. You know, it is still a small sample size at the end of the day, and I think we can take those results into consideration, but really what we need to be taking into consideration is the meta, such as it is. You know, Modern still wide open, still definitely hard to meta game Modern, but there's still a relatively defined meta, even if you just look at broad archetypes, you need to be prepared for. So we need to be prepared for the meta, and we need to have an internal balance with our 60, with our 15, and with having the right amount of cards, not too many, not too few, for any given archetype. So, and then within the confines of those broader considerations, we should just be trying to make the tiny tweaks to find the best cards. So let's start with that in mind when we talk about our change number one, which was the Marsh Flats coming in for the Twilight Mire. Now, I've talked about this from day one on this channel when I made my original deck tech. And by the way, if anybody wants like the line-by-line introductory deck tech to the green-black rock archetype, you can find that in the description below as well, my original deck tech, with much poorer quality audio, so be prepared for that. But, you know, if you want the line-by-line, you can find that there. Might be a good place to start if you're new to the archetype. Anyway, all the way back in that video, if I recall, and multiple times since, I've talked about this, what I consider to be the only real flex slot, unless you want to play fewer fields or fewer manlands for some reason, which I don't think is correct. The green-black deck doesn't have that many flex slots, surprisingly, in the land base. I think there's only really one of them, and that can be a Marsh Flats, it can be a Twilight Mire, or it can be an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, or it could be maybe a 5th basic land, but I'm not so much a fan of the 5th swamp, rather, that would be the 7th basic land total, the 5th swamp. Not so much a fan of that. So I've tried Twilight Mire for a while, and I like it. I do like it. I don't have many complaints about the card, but the one complaint is the downside of the card that I have said, you know, I've identified from day one on this channel, which is that it cannot cast your turn 1 black spells. Usually that's going to be a discard spell, but sometimes being able to just play a land and pass holding up Fatal Push is really good too. Twilight Mire, if it's your only black producing source in your opening hand, does not let you do that, even if you have like a forest and you can filter the forest into double black starting turn 2. Twilight Mire is still, that's the gap in productivity when you're playing a Twilight Mire. Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth is another one that I've tried in some tournament practice lobby games, but haven't quite brought to the competitive stuff yet. But I do think it's very viable. It's better, of course, at casting those things turn 1, and it also lets you make double black, even triple black if you need it, all off of that 1 mana source. So that's all very good. But of course it doesn't do anything the other way. It doesn't give you green. So Twilight Mire has kind of, and Urborg, they both have kind of high ceilings, but they're both a bit limited in certain ways, right? Marsh Flats is kind of the safest choice, and I'll explain. So our deck is not bad at all against Blood Moon, but we can still get cheesed out by a Blood Moon. Marsh Flats gives us a 5th fetch land to help us against that. Marsh Flats is also, like any other fetch land, it's what you need when you need it. You can hold up the activation if you can afford to sometimes. You can get a basic if that makes sense. You can get an Overgrown Tomb if that makes sense. Marsh Flats is just, I mean, fetch lands, they're a staple of Eternal formats. There's a reason they're so expensive. It's because they're so ubiquitous. So why have we not played this before? Well, I've never really felt the need to, and one of the big strengths of the Golgari deck is how painless its land base is. And even this paying 1 life, you know, it can and does matter, especially in an aggro-heavy format like Modern. That said, I've seen Twilight Mire a lot. This is not me dismissing that card or moving away from it permanently, but I've seen enough of Twilight Mire where I'm now starting to appreciate what a Marsh Flats could, in theory, bring to the table. So that's why we're making that change. There's also, you know, the upsides of maybe having a higher chance to get a land type in your graveyard for Tarmogoyf, having a higher chance to get a second clue off of a Tireless Tracker, things like this. Lots of little upsides and lots of little downsides too, to be fair, compared to the alternatives, but we are going to give the 5th fetch land a try. And I chose Marsh Flats. It really doesn't matter much, by the way, like if you're in paper or online. You want to try the 5th fetch land, just play whatever you own as long as it's black. You want a black one, not a green one, but Bloodstained Mire and Polluted Delta are fine. But if you own them all, or if it doesn't matter to you, I'd go with the Marsh Flats for a very narrow corner case reason. Basically, like, if we play out a couple average turns of our deck, 2-3 turns, the opponent's probably going to know if they're well informed that we're not on Jund. They're going to have some kind of a hint that it's not a Jund deck, whether it be them seeing Fields of Ruin, or maybe like Hissing Quagmire, or just, just any number of other things could really give the game away that we are a 2-color deck. But, and so for that reason, playing a Bloodstained Mire as a 5th fetch land doesn't really trick anybody into thinking that we're on Jund. But playing a Marsh Flats could put the seed in their mind that we're on Abzan, because remember that the white splash for Abzan is usually a lot smaller, a lot more of a micro splash than the red splash for Jund. Jund is like a true 3-color deck. It really uses all 3 colors heavily. Marsh Flats, yeah, this could make people wonder, at least if we're on Abzan, and maybe we get a tiny edge there. Like I said, it really doesn't matter, but if you have the luxury to choose, maybe you go with the Marsh Flats. Obviously, they're all fine, but, if you can choose, don't play the Polluted Delta. This is a green-black deck. We don't want those blue vibes in here, We can utilize the colors red and white sometimes to our advantage, but it's all in service of the green-black agenda. And blue is the antithesis of the green-black agenda. We don't want the permission vibes. We don't want the counter-magic vibes. Get that stuff out of here. It's not what we want. So, Marsh Flats, strictly better than Polluted Delta in this deck. You heard it here first. Now, in all seriousness, 5th fetch land, we'll see how it goes. I'm liking the idea of it. So, moving on to a much bigger decision than tweaking the land base, which is bringing back the 4th Liliana of the Veil. Now, I have been a champion of the 3-2 split. I've also been a champion, more generally, of the card Liliana the Last Hope. So why have I opted to revert to a more traditional, a more classic 4-1 split? Well, quite simply because Lily of the Veil, to me, is better positioned now than she has been perhaps since I started this channel. Perhaps in the last half a year or so. I don't think she's been this well positioned. She is underrated. She is very good against the new hot deck of the format, which is the blue-red Phoenixes. She's very good against the Phoenix deck. Coming down, Edicting Thing in the Ice is amazing. Edicting away a Crackling Drake is still pretty good, even though they drew off it. Still a great answer. And her +1, some people kind of assume that she's not good against that deck because they have Graveyard Recursion and she's bad against Dragon. She's bad against really committed Graveyard decks. But they only really use the Phoenixes themselves as recurring threats out of the yard. And yes, they have other things that they can discard and maybe get a little bit of value back, but emptying their hand, stopping them from chaining a bunch of spells together, whether it be to recur a Phoenix or to flip a thing, these are all very, her +1 is genuinely very powerful against them in a lot of windows too. More, and then beyond Phoenix, control decks are still a bit of a boogeyman. So we still have access to 2 Lily the Last Hope, who is good against control, but she's less good against blue-white control specifically than perhaps she seems, simply because they don't put all that many things into our graveyard. So in most scenarios, especially against blue-white control, I would way rather have Lily of the Veil. She is the one that does the most damage and threatens to win the games single-handedly. And having 4 of her when these control decks are still a bit of a problem definitely feels good. We're seeing some other changes from Ravnica Allegiance that bring changes to the modern format. Burn is definitely on the upswing. People are trying Skewer the Critics, which seems really good, and Light Up the Stage, which I think the jury is still out on, but could give Burn a boost as well. Lily of the Veil's good against burn. She's definitely better than Lily of the Last Hope. There's other things that may or may not catch on, like the Prime Speaker Vanifar, pseudopod lists. Lily of the Veil's great there, just edicting stuff away, attacking their resources, This is all very, very good. So in short, like I just said at the beginning of this little spiel, Liliana of the Veil, to me, seems better positioned than she has been in a while. Therefore, we are going to revert to the classic 4-1 split, bringing Liliana back. But you know what? We cannot play with fewer than 2 Lily the Last Hopes. She is amazing. She's such a high ceiling. She's so useful in so many matchups. And I've been a little bit schizophrenic, admittedly, in my deck techs with this card specifically, because sometimes I go 1-1, and then I'm back to 2 main, and then I'm back to 1-1, and so on and so forth. But that's the beauty of this card, is I think you do always want to, and I think she's almost optimal as a 1-1 split, because in a lot of matches, she's your actual best card, and in a lot of matchups, she's dead enough where you want to side her out, right? So having the 1-1 split, totally fine, seems really good to me. And, there are instances where 2 main is great. I think having 5 3-mana Planeswalkers main deck is just something that I'm really interested in, right? So if I don't think the 4th Liliana of the Veil is good, then I want to play the 3-2 split, even though she specifically, Last Hope specifically, might be best as a 1-1 split. But if I do think the 4th Lily of the Veil is good, then if I'm correct, we're optimized in every way. We have the optimal 4 copies of Lily of the Veil, we have the optimal 5 total copies of 3-mana Planeswalkers in the main, and we have the optimization of Last Hope specifically with a 1-1 side main split, where we're hedged, like we can... we've got 1 main we can see. If she's not great, well, we just side her out, and we haven't lost that much by seeing the 1 main. But if she's really good, we can side the second one in, and we were already half pre-boarded. You know what I mean? So, that's the logic behind the Liliana setup. And we had no choice but to remove a card to keep our Lily the Last Hope number 2 around. So I'll tell you what I considered doing here. It was basically between the Choke and the 3rd Fulminator Mage. My first decision before I revised it was actually to cut a 3rd Fulminator Mage, because as good as the Fulminators are, my reasoning was that, well, I really can't play without the 2nd Lily the Last Hope. I don't think that's correct. And I've been good with 2 Fulminators in the past, even pre-trophy I was sometimes fine with 2. So that's kind of like a free cut almost, but the more I thought about it, I was like, no. Fulminator Mage is good in all of the matchups Choke is good in, with a couple of very fringe exceptions. Merfolk is probably the least fringe exception. And Choke is not even a slam dunk against Merfolk, because they play a fair amount of utility lands, they play Ether Vial, right? So that just shows you how much overlap Fulminator has with Choke. But it's not really vice versa, because, yes, they're both great against blue-based control. But Fulminator is also great against BGX mirrors. It's also great against... It's your best card most of the time against big mana. Tron, Amulet Titan, Titan Shift. All of these things, Fulminator is an all-star. It's really good against burn, honestly. It's really good against Infect, Affinity, Hardened Scales Affinity, anything that tries to kill you with manlands. Heck, I mentioned Merfolk. If you really have nothing better to do now that you don't have a Choke, you could bring in a Fulminator against Merfolk. It's not necessarily good, but hey, it can pop a Mutavault, right? So, this card is legitimately amazing, and I'm very glad I decided to keep the 3rd one in and kick the Choke out instead. Now, obviously, they do very different things. Fulminator Mage, you know what you're going to get. It's going to come down, and it's either going to Stone Rain something immediately, or it's going to be a Grey Ogre that eventually Stone Rains something, whether you're waiting for a manland, or whether you're using it to chump block first, or to get some damage across first, whatever. Or if you're just going to use it as a 2-2 forever. And then if they have to spend a removal spell on it, you get to kill a land in response. That's what Fulminator does. You know what you're going to get. Choke was a much higher variance card. Choke, I have single-handedly won games on the back of Choke. I've cast a Choke, and the game basically ends. I have also cast a Choke and had it not do much of anything. And I think the final straw for me with Choke, in terms of evaluating it, not that this is a recent development, but the fact that Teferi can manually untap lands and get the blue-white control player out from under a Choke, that's just very bad. And again, I say final straw, it's not like this was something I just discovered or something that just entered the meta. That's been true forever since Teferi's been around, but it's kind of the final straw in terms of Choke keeping its place in the sideboard. Like, if blue-white control and Jeskai control had no... Like, if Teferi didn't do that, if Teferi didn't get them out from under the Choke, then I would feel almost obligated to keep it in, because it can be an I win card, but the fact that it's so high variance inherently, and then on top of everything, and it's narrow, and on top of everything else, our arch nemesis Teferi can still just, basically play around the Choke like it isn't there. That's just too much for me. Again, when Choke is competing with a card like Fulminator Mage, that is excellent in multiples. Like, if you see one, you usually want to see the second and the third. And of course, remember, we still have 2 Lily the Last Hope. She can buy the Fulminator back. It's a really, really good time. So that's why I ultimately opted to keep the Fulminator and cut away the Choke to make room for our Last Hope. Now, of course, I considered everything else. I considered... you guys know by now that you've seen enough games where I have to, it's Maelstrom Pulse or die. This card is just too good. You always have to consider it, because it's like, do I really need 2 in my 75? But in my opinion, yes. Yes, we do. We need the 2. So Pulse has to stay. I think EE is really underrated in this deck. It's got to stay. Kitchen Finks has been amazing ever since I started playing with it, and especially with Burn on the uptick. That has to stay. Ditto Collective Brutality. Nissa Vital Force is a card that I've perhaps blasphemously considered cutting once or twice. She's just 5 mana. She's an outlier. She costs 5 mana. Like, should I really be playing a 5 mana bomb in Modern? I've won so many games on the back of her. Most games where you bring her in, if she resolves, you're going to win. So I think the answer to that is yes. And then, of course, I considered maybe cutting away some form of Grave Hate here, but I think Faithless Looting decks are still so strong in Modern that we want the high density of Grave Hate. We've got a main deck Nile Spellbomb. We've got 3 main deck Scavenging Oozes. We've got a main deck Kalitas. And then we've got 4 other direct Grave Hate pieces to bring in from the side. Of course, Surgical doing double duty against combo decks. Grafdigger's Cage doing double duty against decks like, Court of Calling, Collected Company, so on and so forth. I really like having this high density. I think you just need it. I think you just need it on a deck like ours. So you have to look at stuff like this, but ultimately I decided to keep it. Collective Brutality, like I said, Burn. Deathmark is another one that I did briefly consider, but I've been very happy to have access to a 5th 1-mana kill spell. Admittedly, a somewhat narrow one, but it's not as narrow as it seems. Most decks where you would play like a 5th copy of Fatal Push, if that was legal from the side, are going to be decks that are hit by the green or white claws here on Deathmark. So that's great. And then, of course, we already talked about the Lily. So the final spot here is Languish. I have considered moving away from sweeper effects entirely, and as you know, if you've seen my previous 2 months deck techs, I've been agonizing over whether Languish should be a damnation ever since I switched to the Dark Confidant build over the Tazagur build. If you're on Tazagur, Languish is clearly superior in my opinion, but if you're on a Bob build, it's a bit of a toss-up, and I still am not entirely sure, but this was where I said, okay, I have made enough changes this month. I am not going to make another change unless I feel confident about it. And I didn't feel confident enough to switch Languish to Damnation. So for now, Languish is still here. And in general, a 4-mana sorcery speed sweeper effect is still here. As I've said before, if I ever switch over to Dark Confidant number 4, that might be when you see me switch the Languish to Damnation. But until then, I think we're going to leave that as is. So, this is what we, on this channel, are going to play through some more competitive leagues coming right up for you, maybe even later on today if I have the time. If not, we'll be looking to do some over the Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Maybe get in a complete league over those few days. Aim to anyway. You know how busy I am, guys. I make all the time I can for this channel, but sometimes life gets in the way. So as always, before I take the field with the deck, I would love to hear feedback from all of you. Let me know what you think about these changes or about any other ideas or observations you have about the list in general. I always welcome the feedback, but like I said, we've been getting fantastic results with a very similar list, and I think all three of these changes are ones that I expect to be positive. We've got Marsh Flats in for Twilight Mire, we've got a 4th Liliana of the Veil, and we've shunted a Last Hope over to the side to make room for that, and in turn we've had to cut a Choke. So those were the changes, and that's what we're up to. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much in advance for giving me your feedback on this. Thank you for those of you who are subscribed to the channel. I would love that, and if you're not, I please encourage you to subscribe. Doesn't take more than a moment of your time, and that would really help my channel grow. You can like, you can share, you can comment, and of course, you can support me on Patreon. I would love that even more. So thanks again to all of my Patreons. Once again, welcome to our newest confidant, Jack Thompson, and let me know what you think about this video. I will see you guys soon. I hope you have a great day.